The roadmap is asking people to start to think about when they might make the switch to or switch away from a fossil fuel vehicle, which might be towards an electric vehicle or might be towards some combination of public transport, shared car use, e-bike, whatever works for them. But even ahead of that, you can just decide to wake up in the morning and try and get to work or school or wherever you're going in a different way.
That was Steve Skelton, one of the authors of the government's carbon neutral roadmap, which has been published today. It sets out some firm policies to incentivise lifestyle changes that we'll all have to make if the island is to achieve its aim of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. By doing so, policymakers and politicians say the Jersey will be playing its part in avoiding catastrophic and irreversible climate change that will have a devastating impact on communities around the world. In the short term, the roadmap sets out how government will spend £23 million already earmarked for climate change initiatives. Longer term, it sets out more policies and sources of funding that future Council of Ministers might consider to complete the journey. Steve has come into the Bailiwick Express studio to explain more. Steve, today we received the carbon neutral roadmap, which has been published by the government. It obviously follows on from something we had, a document we heard quite recently, which was the carbon neutral preferred strategy, which set the framework of the roadmap and also aligned Jersey to the Paris Agreement to achieve net zero carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Can you just explain the high level, what the roadmap really tries to achieve?
Yeah, of course. The roadmap is the culmination of the work that was started with the declaration of a climate emergency in 2019. And it's been put together following the process that was established in a strategy that was agreed by the States Assembly in 2020. And that's involved a lot of engagement with islanders, a lot of opportunity for them to have their say. We had the Citizens' Assembly earlier this year, and we've had in-committee debates in the Assembly. And using all that information, as well as our sort of technical evidence, we've put together effectively two new things. The first is the long-term roadmap, if you like. So that shows where we need to get to over the next 30 years, what our milestones are along the way, what some of the decisions we'll have to take are, and then also what we call the delivery plan, which is a series of around about 30 policies which try and help us become carbon neutral, particularly in the next few years.
So let's look at those deliverables. So we're looking over, what is it, between now and 2026, is that right?
Yes, well, the next 4 years, so I guess calendar years will be through to the end of 25, yeah.
And this is spending the £23 million that the government has already allocated into the Climate Emergency Fund, which has primarily been funded by a levy on fuel, on fuel, is that right?
That is right, yeah. So back in 2020, the government plan established a climate emergency fund. And in the last few years, the AMPO on fuel, on the petrol and diesel we all buy at the pump, has been increased by a few pence over the RPI increase. And that money has been hypothecated and put into the fund so that it can be spent on projects that help us decarbonise. Right,
so we've got £23 million to spend over the next term of the government plan. How's that money going to be spent?
Well, the work has obviously looked at where our emissions are coming from, and I'm sure many of your listeners will know that a lot of that in Jersey on island is around transport and heating systems, both in our own homes and in our businesses. And so most of the money goes to policies that try and move us from our existing fossil fuel transport and heating systems into low carbon, primarily electric heating systems. And to do that, we need to do a couple of things. We need carrots and we need sticks. And the carrots come in the form of a series of incentive schemes, so support to reduce the cost of an electric vehicle purchase or electric vehicle charging system, or a heating system change. And then the sticks come in the form of new regulations or commitments to bring in new regulations, which over time should start to phase out polluting technologies in our homes and businesses and on our roads.
So drilling down a little bit further, so just give me an example, someone who is up for buying a new car, so there will be incentives for them to choose an electric car over an internal combustion engine.
That's right. And at this stage, obviously, we're putting the sort of general proposal out for consultation. We need to do quite a lot of work on, for example, what would be the eligibility criteria? What website would you go to? Would you get a voucher code? Would you, how would you do all of that is still to be designed. But the basic premise is that when you, recognising that doing the right thing, in this case, buying a non-polluting or a vehicle with no emissions costs more money, then there should be some financial incentive alongside that. As the cost of those vehicles reduces, the incentive is likely to reduce as well, and so we hope it encourages people to make that change sooner rather than later.
So does the roadmap envisage a electric island in terms of there's no more internal combustion engines driving around our roads, whether that be individuals or whether that be commercial?
So I think the right fuel source of the future very much depends on what it is. So, I mean, cars and small vans, we see electric options coming forward already. And obviously electricity, if it's generated from a low carbon source, it is a low carbon provider of energy. There are other sort of energy uses that aren't viable in that way. And so there's also policies in the roadmap around reducing the duty on second generation renewable diesel, or green diesel as people may know it. And that's got a lot of use cases for perhaps heavier vehicles, buses, or some of the plant that is used by public services in the island. So not everything will be electric, and certainly not immediately. There are different avenues for different sorts of systems, heating and transport.
Just looking at heating, obviously a lot of islanders will have gas and oil burners and tanks. Could you just outline how the roadmap might affect them?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're keen to hear islanders' views on is a policy which has a couple of parts, and certainly we are committed to, or ministers have set out a commitment to uprate what are called the building bylaws, the standards by which new builds and renovations are judged. But also to do that in such a way that from it's suggested in the consultation draft from the start of 2026, new connections of oil and gas boilers would not meet standards, would not be allowed. If you had those systems in your house, they can still be fixed. If they fail, there need to be emergency cover arrangements in place. But when it comes to replacing systems, we would want people to be able to replace them with low carbon or zero carbon alternatives. And back to our previous conversation, that may in many cases be electric. It may not always be electric. And so we're talking, as you can imagine, to fuel providers about options for alternative, what are called non-fossil hydrocarbons. So like the green diesel I talked about before, and the heating system options and alternatives that are available. Now, for £23 million at one level is a lot of money, but at another level it's a half a secondary school. It's a very expensive 1K house. What happens when that money is used up? Obviously, this is going to cost more than that. How much will it cost? And where do you think that source of funding will be to bridge from 2026 all the way to 2050? Yep. So this is a big question that we obviously are giving plenty of thought to. I think so. How much will it cost? We can only really know the costs of the things we're setting out to do, and those are set out in the roadmap. So the policies that have been designed are modelled in terms of how much they should reduce our emissions, and the roadmap sets out that if they were sort of fully applied, that cost to government would be around about £250 million. That's including the 23 that's available now. But it's important to say that's the cost of, for example, giving you an incentive to buy an electric vehicle. The additional money you might spend on that electric vehicle, it would obviously come from your income and from your budget, as it were. And so that's not something that we are able to really profile, because we don't know what car you're going to go and buy and whether that's going to cost more or less. So in terms of the direct cost to government of the current policies, around about 250 million. Where might that come from? Well, the roadmap sets out sort of three sources. The first is the Climate Emergency Fund, which is already available to us. The second is a commitment which is in the government plan currently to look at 4 new polluter pays charges in areas such as road use or commercial solid waste charging, for example. They will be considered, they may be brought forward, they may not be, and some of that income should be available for the Climate Emergency Fund. Beyond that, the strategy commits to essentially answering the question of how we close the gap, but that's work that's going to have to take place over the next 18 months and be agreed by a future Council of Ministers. But it does commit to looking at all the options from use of consolidated fund general taxation through to options to work with partners to jointly invest or anything else.
Does the roadmap make any suggestions on whether the government structure should change in order to improve the chances of success with its implementation?
If we think about government as the ministerial portfolios, then the answer's yes. There was a recommendation made by the Citizens' Assembly that government should look to have a ministerial portfolio for energy and climate change, and that's been considered by the steering group that put this together, and that is being recommended in the roadmap. We would hope that recommendation was picked up by the next Council of Ministers.
And looking at other sectors, we've looked in the short term at transport and heating because that's the biggest carbon and greenhouse gas emitters in Jersey. What about other sectors? What about aviation is a key one, construction as well. These are all greenhouse gas emitting industries in Jersey.
That's absolutely right. As I sort of touched on before, the roadmap's prioritised work in those areas that generate the most emissions, but we've also talked about the sort of future scenario for aviation and working with colleagues at Ports of Jersey. There's a sort of a statement to try and align to an industry emissions trajectory, which is called a Jet Zero Scenario 2, I think, and that is towards the ambitious end of what I think aviation industry are trying to deliver, and it aims for net zero aviation by 2050, but also crucially for Jersey, net zero domestic aviation by 2040, I think. So I know that colleagues at Ports are very keen to make the most of the routes, but also I think the independence we have as a jurisdiction to push us to the forefront of decarbonised aviation and to really try and make some progress in that area.
And what does the roadmap say about how Jersey can absorb its own carbon and start taking a little bit more responsibility in terms of its own sequestration or other things, that more solar, more renewable energy? What can Jersey do, and what does the roadmap say about that?
So as a small island, we've obviously got limited options around on-island sequestration, so tree planting. But we do have access to our marine environment, and the roadmap does set an ambition for us to try and significantly increase the sequestration potential of our seas, what's known as blue carbon. It's important to recognise that blue carbon currently is not it's not recognised by the international greenhouse gas accounting standards as a sequestration, but we would hope that would the science would back up a change in that as we go forward, and I know there are other places in the world that would want to see that as well. So it says there's a huge option, an opportunity there for us, and put some funding towards the work necessary to try and unlock that.
And how does Jersey's roadmap compare with others? Obviously, lots of nations have signed up for Paris, but does this put us ahead? Does this put us on a par with comparable jurisdictions?
I think that's a really good question. I would say it probably puts us on a par with comparable jurisdictions. So our access, if you like, to the Paris Agreement is by an extension of the UK's ratification. And that would be available to other Crown dependencies, and we've talked with them and talked with UK government ministers at COP26 about that, an extension of that ratification. So we think we're on a par with where the other Crown dependencies are going, and on a par with where the UK are going. It's reasonably fair to say that the UK set reasonably ambitious targets, but certainly not anything out with what the science says is necessary to try and limit global warming to around about 1.5 degrees.
And just tell me how the roadmap fits in with other government policies. I'm just for people may be a bit confused. We've got the sustainable transport policy, which encourages us to get the bus. We've got the Bridge and Island Plan, which gives guidance on what building quality and where houses can be built. How does this fit in with other policies?
So it's been obviously developed with an eye on those other policies, and you'll see references, between the documents. I think one of the things that obviously we are conscious of as sort of civil servants is that until the roadmap is adopted by the States Assembly, it's not formal policy. So some of the impacts it will have on things like planning policy or an economic strategy will only come once it has formal standing within the kind of the public policy framework. So it will continue to have downstream impacts, but I think once it is in place, we'll see those impacts quite broad. It will have to require a degree of action in a lot of strategic areas in the future years.
And just this is quite a high level question, Steve, but how will this impact the everyday lives of islanders, and what choices can everyday islanders make which will either be compatible with the roadmap or indeed encouraged by the roadmap?
So a lot of people, I think, already are familiar with the basic tenets of sort of how to try and do your bit. Travel and transport is a real opportunity because, yes, the roadmap is asking people to start to think about when they might make the switch to or switch away from a fossil fuel vehicle, which might be towards an electric vehicle or might be towards some combination of public transport, shared car use, e-bike, whatever works for them. But even ahead of that, you can just decide to wake up in the morning and try and get to work or school or wherever you're going in a different way, preferably on a day that's not raining. But there's lots of stuff people can do in that space already, and there's plenty of advice out there, including on the government website, for people who want to look at the action they can take now.
Finally, Steve, this is a period of consultation which follows this. Just tell me a little bit about consultation, how long it lasts, how people can engage, and when the states will make a decision.
We've obviously had the benefit of a lot of input already, and you can see some of the read-through from those early ideas through the Citizens' Assembly into these policies. So there's a lot of consultation gone into it already, and this final phase of consultation, sort of final check on the proposals, runs through to the end of January. There will be a range of ways to get involved. So there's the best way is to look at the document, or if you're a little bit time-pressed, to look at the summary document, or even the video that will be on the website, and then to look at the survey that's been put out, which is not too long, hopefully, and people can engage with that. Equally, if you want to read the full thing and provide written comments on any of that, then we're very happy to take those as well. We'll be running stakeholder briefings, and we'll be supporting our colleagues in education and in schools to have conversations about this. We will be running some focus groups and other things, and keep an ear out for the adverts, and keep an eye out for the links through to this survey. And then, we hope that we get a really good response, and we can use that to inform the final draft in the new year. That needs to be lodged in March, and we hope it will be debated in the Assembly in April.
Thanks to Steve Skelton for talking with me today, and thank you for listening to the Bailiwick Podcast. You can find the podcast on all the usual pod places, and don't forget to like and share. The music at the beginning and end of this podcast is I Shift My Weight by Luno. Tune in next week for more.